So my question is, why does history matter? And here's my answer. Benedict Anderson was quite right. Nations are imagined communities. Even if over time, what's imagined gains substance and weight. When we claim to be, say, British, what is it we imagine? We imagine ourselves to be part of a national narrative or story which endows our little lives with larger, if not ultimate, significance. And this story is made up of common endeavors, heroes, the laying down of traditions, and the building of institutions. But of course, we identify ourselves with these things only because we think them good and valuable, only because they elicit our admiration, only because they inspire us. We are British because we identify ourselves with, for example, Britain's leadership of global endeavors to abolish slavery, with heroes such as Elizabeth I or William Wilberforce or Winston Churchill, with the tradition of constitutional constraints on executive power, with institutions such as parliamentary democracy and legislated liberal rights. We identify with these things only because they are good. Our national identification is moral. It's moral, but it's also conservative. Because these endeavors, heroes, traditions, and institutions are good and valuable, we rightly want to conserve them or the memory of them, to keep either them or their inspiration alive. We want to keep the flame burning. So patriots imagine themselves to be part of a national story, a story of virtuous people achieving good things, a moral story that inspires and is for that reason worthy of personal identification and investment. So far, so good. But there are dangers here. The dangers of national idolatry and of oppressive national self-righteousness. The dangers of imagining us to be simply good and them to be simply bad. So there I was, age 9, in my Ayrshire Scottish boarding school. It was 1964, and I just watched Peter Watkins' classic historical docudrama about the Battle of Culloden in 1745. That's the one that Bonnie Prince Charlie lost, in case you've forgotten. The film was over, and it was time for bed. So up the stairs to my dormitory, I dragged myself, weeping. Why do we, the Scots, always lose to the Sassenach, the Saxon, the English? Despite a mother from County Durham and a Yorkshire-educated Scottish father, before I reached my second decade, the tragic, heroic narrative of Scottish victimhood and English oppression had taken possession of me. I had bought entirely into the story of the Scottish us versus the English them. And all that in spite of what Peter Watkins' film actually said. Because I discovered when watching it again in the mid-1990s at the age of 40, that Watkins clearly shows that the Battle of Culloden was not a binary conflict between Scots and English. It was between Gaelic-speaking, cattle-rustling, feudal, Catholic Highland Scots on the one hand, and on the other, government troops, which included English-speaking, farming, Protestant Lowland Scots. My people had worn red coats, not kilts. The national story I had imagined and was inhabiting, and which stoked feelings of victimhood and resentment, was false. History matters. Which history matters? It matters politically. When too many Scots, in my view, align themselves with Scottish independence, they do it, most of them, not because they've analysed policies. They do it in large part because they inhabit imaginatively a vision of the past that is false, a Braveheart past that excites unjustified nationalist indignation and resentment against the English and against Britain today. In so doing, this false history also threatens one of the liberal West's important, if secondary, pillars at a time of aggressive threat from illiberal Russia and China. As a former UK diplomat has written, and I quote, "As British ambassador to the UN, I watched with some anxiety from New York the final days of the Scottish referendum campaign in September 2014. My Russian opposite number sympathised with barely suppressed glee at the prospect of the UK dismembered and its permanent seat on the UN Security Council called into question. It was clear to me that Scottish independence would have had a devastating impact on the UK's standing in the world, much greater than withdrawal from the EU ever would." History matters politically. Our reading of the past shapes which national community and traditions and institutions we identify ourselves with and which we repudiate. It determines the fate of nations and of the world. The political significance of the decolonizing epidemic that's been sweeping through our institutions since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020 is that it corrodes any reason to identify with Britain's 3 centuries-long imperial career of global engagement, or with its afterlife in Britain's role as a still important pillar of the now US-led West. Decolonizing history portrays the British Empire as nothing but a litany of racism, economic exploitation, cultural repression, and wanton violence. It refers to colonialism and slavery as if those two things were identical. But they are not. As I argued in my book on colonialism, the record of the British Empire is a morally mixed one. Yes, there was a century and a half of slavery, but there was also a subsequent, more recent century and a half of anti-slavery. Yes, unarmed Indians in Amritsar were shot down by General Dyer in 1919, but Indian women were saved from the funeral pyres of their husbands when sooty was banned in 1829. Yes, the Empire abused its military power in sending gunboats to bombard Canton in 1839, but the British Empire also fielded the only military resistance to the massively murderous racist regime in Nazi Berlin from May 1940 and June 1941, with the sole exception of Greece. Britain's imperial record was a morally mixed one, but so is that of any long-standing state. As a Christian Burkean conservative, I don't expect perfection in any human affairs. Those who rule, just like those who are ruled, are creatures and sinners, finite and flawed. Even as I recognize the duty to repent and improve, I expect even the noblest of human efforts to be marred by limited power, moral obtuseness, and culpable failure. And so I fear, indeed I loathe, the unforgiving, inhumane impatience of utopian perfectionists, whether they are Maoists or agents of Islamic State, or progressive, twittering social justice warriors. That's why I opposed the dismantling of the statue of Cecil Rhodes in early 2016, not because, as some on the left continue to assert, I regarded him as a hero. I didn't and I don't. He was no Hitler, but he was certainly no St. Francis. The reason I opposed his dismantling was that it would represent the public triumph of a scarily self-righteous, unforgivingly damning, and slanderously pejorative story about Britain's imperial past. Apart from the ascendancy of unforgiving politics, why else would the triumph of cultural revolutionary decolonization matter? It would matter because of the political power of guilt. In 1976, the Baghdad-born Jewish historian Eli Kaduri published his book, The Anglo-Arab Labyrinth. In this he wrote, and I quote, "No doubt great powers do commit great crimes, but a great power is not always and necessarily in the wrong. And the canker of imaginary guilt, even the greatest power can ill withstand." The guilt Kaduri had in mind was the conviction that the British had betrayed the Arabs in permitting Jewish immigration into Palestine after the First World War, since it's alleged they had promised that Palestine would be part of a new Arab state. Kaduri argues convincingly, I think, that Britain had in fact made no such promise and betrayed no one. Nevertheless, the canker of imaginary guilt had come to infect the British Foreign Office, to weaken British self-confidence and to misshape British foreign policy. Today, thanks to the decolonizing movement and its exploitation of widespread historical ignorance, we are again succumbing to a fresh and more general guilt about our colonial past. A guilt that's determining the decisions and policies of our cultural institutions, weakening the soft international power of the Crown, and making us vulnerable to infinite claims of reparation for ancient wrongs. History matters. It matters politically. And the truth about our imperial past does not support either the making of reparations for slavery, or the disintegration of the United Kingdom, or the abandonment of Britain's defense of the West. Much of what our forebears achieved was extraordinary. We need to remember it. We need to admire it. We need to conserve it. And then we need to build on it.